The howling wind battered the small wooden cabin, but the storm raging inside was far more dangerous than the blizzard that had engulfed Bisbee, Arizona on that fateful December night in 1879. Eleanor Hayes clutched her bruised cheek, tears freezing on her face as her husband Vernon's words cut deeper than the bitter cold. "Worthless woman, can't even give me a son after 3 years." Vernon Hayes staggered toward her, whiskey bottle dangling from his meaty fist. His once handsome face was twisted with rage and drink, a far cry from the charming man who had courted her back in St. Louis. "Maybe the cold will put some sense into you." "Vernon, please," Eleanor begged, backing away until she felt the rough wooden wall against her spine. "The storm, it's the worst of the season. No one could survive out there." "Should have thought about that before you lost another baby," he snarled, grabbing her arm with bruising force. Eleanor fought back, clawing at his face, but her slight frame was no match for his strength. With a roar of anger, Vernon dragged her across the room, throwing open the front door to reveal a world transformed into a swirling vortex of white. The blast of icy air stole Eleanor's breath as Vernon shoved her onto the porch. "Don't come back until you're ready to be a proper wife," he growled, slamming the door behind her. The sound of the lock turning was a death sentence. "Vernon," she screamed, pounding on the door until her fists were raw. "Please, I'll die out here." Only the wind answered, moaning through the pines surrounding their isolated cabin. Eleanor huddled against the door, wrapping her thin cotton dress around herself. She wore no coat, no boots, just the simple house dress she'd been wearing while preparing supper. Her dark hair whipped around her face as she desperately considered her options. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away. The town of Bisbee lay 5 miles beyond that, an impossible journey in this weather without proper clothing. Still, staying meant certain death. With trembling legs, Eleanor stepped off the porch into snow that reached her knees. The bitter cold pierced through her like needles as she staggered forward, disoriented by the whirling snow that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Each step became torture as her bare feet grew numb, then agonizingly painful. She wasn't sure how long she walked, minutes or hours, before she fell for the first time, her legs refusing to support her. "Get up," she commanded herself, rising on trembling limbs only to fall again. And again. Each time it took more effort to stand. Her thoughts became sluggish, a strange warmth spreading through her despite the cold. Part of her knew this was danger, the deceptive comfort that came before freezing to death. Eleanor's world narrowed to a pinpoint of determination. One more step. Just one more. She no longer knew which direction she traveled, whether toward town or deeper into the wilderness. The mountains around Bisbee were unforgiving in winter, home to mountain lions and wolves that would make quick work of a vulnerable woman. Through the curtain of snow, she spotted a faint golden glow, a lantern, a hallucination. She couldn't be sure, but it was the only hope she had. Summoning her last reserves of strength, Eleanor staggered toward the light, collapsing against what felt like wooden steps. A porch, a cabin, salvation. With frozen fingers, she reached up to knock, but her strength failed her. The last thing Eleanor remembered was the sound of her body slumping against a door as darkness claimed her. Jackson Miller was no stranger to the harsh winters of the Arizona Territory. 8 years working his small ranch outside Bisbee had taught him to respect the sudden mountain storms that could transform a mild winter day into a deadly blizzard. He'd spent the evening securing his livestock, ensuring his horses and small herd of cattle were safely in the barn with enough feed to last several days. Now, as the fire crackled in his stone hearth, he sat in his favorite chair repairing a saddle strap, his loyal cattle dog Rusty dozing at his feet. The wind howled around his cabin like a living thing, rattling the shutters he'd carefully fastened before nightfall. "Quite a storm, eh, Rusty?" he murmured to the dog, who lifted his head and pricked his ears suddenly. A second later, Jackson heard it to a faint thud against his front door. Rusty was on his feet immediately, growling low in his throat. "Easy, boy," Jackson set aside his work and reached for the Winchester rifle he kept propped by the door, a necessary precaution in these parts. Outlaws weren't uncommon, and even decent men could turn desperate in weather like this. "Who's there?" He called out, receiving no answer but another soft sound, not a knock, but the slide of something against wood. Keeping the rifle ready, Jackson cautiously opened the door, nearly tripping over the body that tumbled across his threshold. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, quickly setting the rifle aside to kneel next to the motionless form. It was a woman, young and half frozen, her dark hair crusted with ice and skin pale as moonlight. Her fingers were blue, her thin dress soaked through and frozen in places. For a horrified moment, Jackson thought she was already dead, until he saw the faint cloud of breath escaping her blue-tinged lips. "Rusty, back," he ordered, scooping the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, her body rigid with cold. Jackson kicked the door shut and carried her to the fire, laying her gently on the bearskin rug that covered the plank floor. Up close, he could see she was beautiful, with delicate features and long lashes resting against her cheeks, and she was in grave danger. Jackson had seen cold sickness before. Growing up in Colorado, he'd watched his father, a frontier doctor, treat miners caught in mountain storms. Moving swiftly, he gathered blankets and began removing the woman's frozen clothing, knowing that the wet fabric was drawing precious heat from her body. He worked with clinical detachment, focused solely on saving her life as he wrapped her in warm blankets. Her skin was like ice beneath his calloused fingers. Too cold, dangerously so. Jackson stoked the fire higher, then slid his arms beneath her again, carrying her to his bed. Rusty followed anxiously, sensing his master's concern. "Need to warm her slowly," Jackson muttered to himself, remembering his father's teachings. Too much heat too quickly could kill someone in her condition. He piled every blanket he owned on top of her still form, then hesitated briefly before making a decision. Stripping down to his long underwear, Jackson slipped beneath the blankets beside her. Body heat was the surest way to save someone suffering from severe cold. He pulled her gently against his chest, wincing at the chill of her skin against his. Like embracing a corpse, he thought grimly, then pushed the macabre thought away. "Come on, miss," he whispered, rubbing her arms and back through the blanket. "Don't you die on my watch." Through the long night, Jackson kept vigil, periodically checking her pulse and breathing. Twice he rose to stoke the fire higher, returning quickly to share his warmth. Near dawn, he felt her stirring, a soft moan escaping her lips as consciousness slowly returned. When Eleanor opened her eyes, confusion washed over her. This wasn't her cabin. The roof above was made of hand-hewn logs rather than the rough sawn boards Vernon had hastily erected. The bed beneath her was soft, the blankets heavy and warm. And there was something else, a presence beside her, radiating heat. She turned her head with effort, finding herself looking into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a man with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble, his expression concerned rather than threatening. "You're awake," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Thought I might lose you for a while there." Eleanor tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She managed only a croak that sent her into a painful coughing fit. The man immediately sat up, reaching for a cup on the bedside table. "Easy now." "Small sips," he instructed, supporting her head as he held the cup to her lips. The water was cool and felt like heaven on her parched throat. "Thank you," she whispered when she could speak. Where am I? Name's Jackson Miller. This is my ranch about 8 miles outside Bisbee." His brow furrowed. "Found you half frozen on my porch last night. Another hour out there and you wouldn't have made it." Memory returned in a brutal flash. Vernon's rage, the blizzard, her desperate journey through the snow. Eleanor closed her eyes against the rush of emotions, a tear escaping despite her effort to contain it. "Miss, are you in pain?" Jackson asked, his voice concerned. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "No, just remembering." Opening her eyes, she met his gaze. "My name is Eleanor Hayes, my husband. He put me out during the storm, said I wasn't a proper wife." Jackson's expression darkened. "He what?" The gentle voice hardened. "He threw you out in this blizzard with no coat, no boots." Eleanor nodded weakly. "I lost our baby last month, the third one. He was drinking and said." She trailed off, unable to repeat Vernon's cruel words. Jackson swore under his breath, then visibly composed himself. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hayes. No woman deserves such treatment. He stood, and Eleanor suddenly realized he was wearing only his underwear. Her cheeks flamed despite her weakness. Noticing her discomfort, Jackson grabbed a shirt from a nearby chair. Sorry for the state of undress. Needed to warm you with body heat medical necessity. My pa was a doctor, he explained, pulling the shirt on. I'll give you some privacy now that you're out of danger. There are some clothes in that trunk that might fit you belonged to my sister before she moved east. Thank you, Eleanor whispered, overwhelmed by his kindness. I don't know how to repay you. Jackson shook his head. No need. Anyone with a speck of humanity would have done the same. He moved toward the door. Rest now, I'll make something to eat. After he left, Eleanor gingerly tested her limbs. Everything ached and her feet were especially painful, but she could move. Slowly, she sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. The room was simple but clean, a man's room, with few decorations save for a drawing of a mountain landscape pinned to the wall and a small photograph of a family on the bedside table. With effort, she made her way to the trunk he'd indicated, finding a simple brown dress that was only slightly too large. It took all her strength to dress herself, and by the time she finished, she was trembling with exhaustion. Still, Eleanor refused to be found in bed when her rescuer returned. She was determined to show strength, though she wasn't entirely sure why it mattered what this stranger thought of her. Jackson returned to find Eleanor seated in a chair by the fire, her dark hair falling in waves down her back, her face still pale but her eyes clear and alert. He carried a tray with 2 steaming bowls of venison stew. You shouldn't be up yet, he admonished, setting the tray down. Your body's been through an ordeal. I've imposed enough, Eleanor replied, the formal words at odds with the simple frontier cabin. I wanted to properly thank you, Mr. Miller. Jackson, he corrected, handing her a bowl, and you're welcome, though I wish the circumstances were different. He settled into the chair opposite her, studying her face more openly now that she was awake. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25, with intelligent green eyes and a natural elegance that suggested she hadn't been raised in these rough mining towns. Your feet need tending, he said after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes. Frostbite's nothing to ignore. Eleanor nodded, having felt the burning pain in her toes. I know some about healing. My mother was a midwife. Then you know this could be serious, Jackson said. May I? He gestured toward her feet, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor extended her legs. Jackson gently removed the thick wool socks he'd put on her during the night, revealing feet that were angry red in places, with several blisters forming. Could be worse, he assessed. No blackened skin. I think you'll keep all your toes, though they'll be mighty sore for a while. From a cabinet, he retrieved a jar of salve, kneeling before her to apply it to her damaged feet with surprisingly gentle hands for a rancher. Eleanor winced at the contact but didn't pull away. How long have you been in Bisbee? Jackson asked, clearly trying to distract her from the pain. 3 years, Eleanor replied. Vernon, my husband, brought us here after the silver strike. He works in the mines. She paused, wondering how much to reveal to this stranger. We were doing well until the babies. Jackson's hands stilled momentarily. I'm sorry for your losses. No mother should endure such sorrow, let alone be punished for it. The simple compassion in his words broke something in Eleanor. The tears she'd held back for so long through 3 lost pregnancies, through Vernon's increasing cruelty, suddenly overwhelmed her. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jackson set aside the salve and rose, awkwardly patting her shoulder. I'll make some tea, he said, giving her space to compose herself. By the time he returned with 2 steaming cups, Eleanor had regained her composure, though her eyes remained red-rimmed. Forgive me, she said. I'm not usually so emotional. Nothing to forgive. Jackson handed her a cup. Seems to me you've earned a good cry, all things considered. Eleanor sipped the tea, studying him over the rim. Jackson Miller was unlike any man she'd met in Bisbee. Most miners were rough, hardened men who saw women as either wives or whores, with little regard for them either way. Vernon had seemed different during their courtship, educated, ambitious, charming, but the harsh realities of frontier life had stripped away that veneer, revealing a cruel streak she hadn't anticipated. This rancher, however, seemed genuinely kind, treating her with respect despite finding her half dead on his doorstep. It was disarming. "The storm's still raging," Jackson said, breaking into her thoughts. "Roads won't be passable for at least 2 days, maybe longer. You're welcome to stay until it's safe to travel." "I'm grateful," Eleanor replied, then hesitated. "But I won't be returning to my husband. I can't." Jackson nodded, unsurprised. "Got family elsewhere you can go to?" Eleanor shook her head. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago. I have an aunt in Philadelphia, but—" She gestured helplessly. The journey east was expensive and dangerous for a woman alone, and she had no money of her own. Vernon controlled every cent they earned. "Well," Jackson said slowly, "no need to decide everything today. You're safe here until you heal, at the very least." Over the next 3 days, the blizzard continued unabated, transforming the landscape into an endless sea of white. Eleanor's strength returned gradually, though her feet remained tender. She insisted on helping with chores, cooking meals from Jackson's stores of preserved meat and vegetables while he tended to his livestock. They fell into an easy rhythm, talking during meals about their lives before Bisbee. Eleanor learned that Jackson had come west after the war, seeking space and solitude after witnessing too much death as a young cavalry scout. He'd purchased this land with his mustering out pay, gradually building a modest herd of cattle and breaking horses for extra income. In turn, she told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a carpenter and a midwife, meeting Vernon at a church social, and their journey west chasing silver dreams. She spoke little of her marriage's deterioration, but Jackson was observant enough to notice the way she flinched at sudden movements or how her hand unconsciously touched her cheek where a fading bruise remained visible. On the 4th morning, Eleanor woke to silence. The howling wind had finally ceased. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, reflecting blindingly off the snow outside. She rose carefully, dressing in the borrowed clothes that had become familiar, and made her way to the main room. Jackson stood by the window, surveying his property. He turned at her approach, and something in his expression made Eleanor's heart skip a beat. "Storm's past," he said unnecessarily. "I need to check the herd, make sure none strayed from the sheltered valley." Eleanor nodded, suddenly uncertain. With the weather cleared, she would be expected to leave to make a decision about her future. "I'll prepare something for your return," she said, falling back on practicality. Jackson hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Eleanor, there's something we should discuss before I go." Her stomach tightened. Here it came the gentle dismissal, the suggestion that she find employment in town or seek charity from the church ladies. "Your husband will be looking for you," Jackson continued, surprising her. "These mining towns' gossip travels fast. Someone will have seen the light in my cabin, will know you're here." Eleanor hadn't considered this. "You think he'll come?" "I think a man who throws his wife into a blizzard doesn't simply forget her." Jackson's jaw tightened. "And I think he won't take kindly to you being here, regardless of the circumstances." "I've placed you in danger," Eleanor realized with horror. "I never intended." Jackson raised a hand to stop her. "I can handle myself. But you need to decide what you want to do before he shows up on my doorstep." Eleanor sank into a chair, mind racing. She had no illusions about Vernon's reaction. He would either try to drag her home or accuse her of adultery, perhaps even attempt to have her arrested. Either way, it would end badly. "I could go to town," she said slowly. "Perhaps the hotel would need help, or the cafe, and be unprotected when he finds you." Jackson shook his head. "Bisbee's lawman is more concerned with drunken minors than protecting women from their husbands." "What choice do I have?" Eleanor asked, frustration coloring her voice. "I have no money, no family nearby, no skills beyond keeping house." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign he was thinking deeply. "There is another option," he said finally. "It's not ideal, but it would offer legal protection." Eleanor looked up at him questioningly. "In this territory, a woman can divorce her husband on grounds of cruelty," Jackson explained. "Judge Parker in Tucson is known to grant such petitions, especially with evidence of physical harm." Hope flared briefly in Eleanor's chest, then died. Vernon would never agree to a divorce, and I have no means to travel to Tucson or pay legal fees. I could help with that, Jackson said quietly. I'm not a wealthy man, but I do all right. Why would you do that for a stranger? Eleanor asked, genuinely perplexed by his generosity. Jackson was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes serious. Because no one helped my mother when she needed it, he finally said. She endured 15 years with my father before pneumonia took her. I was 14, old enough to understand what she'd suffered, too young to do anything about it. He looked away. I swore I'd never stand by while a woman endured such treatment if I could help it. The personal revelation touched Eleanor deeply. Thank you, she whispered. But I can't accept such charity. I need to find my own way. It's not charity, Jackson insisted. It's the right thing to do, and you can repay me when you're on your feet again. Before Eleanor could respond, Rusty began barking furiously outside. Jackson moved to the window, his posture suddenly tense. Riders coming, he said grimly. 3 men, and one of them's wearing a mining company coat. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Vernon, she whispered. Jackson moved quickly, retrieving his rifle from its place by the door. Stay inside, he instructed. No matter what happens, don't come out until I call for you. Eleanor wanted to protest, to insist that this was her problem to face, but the determined set of Jackson's jaw told her argument was futile. She nodded once, then retreated to the bedroom as he stepped outside to meet the approaching riders. Through the cabin's thin walls, she could hear the crunch of hooves on packed snow, then the creak of saddle leather as men dismounted. Rusty's barking grew more intense until Jackson's voice cut through, commanding the dog to silence. Miller, Vernon's voice was instantly recognizable, its forced joviality failing to mask underlying menace. Fine morning after the storm, Hayes. Jackson's reply was neutral. What brings you to my property? Looking for my wife. Vernon's tone hardened. Word in town is you might be harboring her. News travels fast for a town that's been snowed in, Jackson observed. Jed Tompkins rode past yesterday, saw smoke from your chimney. Said he thought he glimpsed a woman through your window. A pause. That would be my Eleanor, I expect. Eleanor pressed closer to the wall, heart pounding. Jed Tompkins was Vernon's drinking companion, a mean-spirited man who'd leered at her more than once. And if there is a woman here. Jackson's voice remained steady. What business is that of yours? A sharp laugh from one of the other men. Hear that, Vernon? Cowboy's got himself a whore and doesn't want to share. Watch your mouth, Jackson snapped. There's no call for such talk. My wife, Vernon said, emphasizing the word, disappeared during the storm 4 days ago. Being a concerned husband, I've been searching for her. Now, are you going to produce her, or do I need to look inside myself? I don't recall inviting you into my home, Jackson replied coldly. And I don't take kindly to threats. No threats, Vernon said, just a husband's right to retrieve his property. Eleanor, he called out. Come on out now, time to come home. Eleanor trembled but remained silent. The law might consider her Vernon's property, but she would no longer accept such treatment. Your property nearly died in that blizzard, Jackson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Found her half frozen on my doorstep, barefoot and wearing nothing but a cotton dress. What kind of man puts his wife out in weather that would kill a healthy steer? What happens between a man and his wife is private business, Vernon retorted. Eleanor's always been dramatic, probably ran off in a fit of temper and got caught in the storm. Now stand aside, Miller. No. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Eleanor heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Don't be stupid, Cowboy, one of the men said. 3 of us, one of you. Math ain't in your favor. You willing to die over another man's wife? Vernon asked, false reasonableness in his tone. Are you? Jackson countered. Because the first man who tries to enter my home without invitation will find out exactly how serious I am. The tension stretched like a wire pulled taut. Eleanor couldn't bear it any longer. These men might kill Jackson, and it would be her fault. Before she could reconsider, she opened the bedroom door and stepped into the main room. Stop this, she called out, moving toward the open front door. No one needs to get hurt. Jackson half turned, keeping his rifle trained on the men. Eleanor, stay back. She ignored him, stepping onto the porch. Vernon stood in the yard, flanked by Jed Tompkins and another miner she recognized as Bill Coker. All three men looked disheveled, Vernon especially so unshaven, eyes bloodshot, clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip. There she is, Vernon said, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. Come to your senses, have you, ready to be a proper wife again? Eleanor straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. I'm not coming back, Vernon, not now, not ever. Vernon's smile vanished. That's not your decision to make, you're my wife. A wife you threw into a blizzard to die, Eleanor replied, finding strength she hadn't known she possessed. A wife you've beaten, belittled, and blamed for losing our children, as if I wanted to feel them slip away inside me. Vernon's face darkened with rage. You shut your mouth. Women don't speak to their husbands this way. This one does, Eleanor said firmly. I'm filing for divorce, Vernon. Judge Parker in Tucson will grant it on grounds of cruelty. Divorce, Vernon spat the word like poison. No wife of mine will drag my name through such filth. You think any decent man will have you after, you'll end up in a brothel where whores like you belong. Jackson stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Eleanor. That's enough, Hayes. You've said your piece. Now get off my land. Vernon's hand tightened on his pistol. Not without what's mine. She's not yours, Jackson said quietly. She's her own woman making her own choice. And she's choosing to stay. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft whine of Rusty, who sensed the dangerous undercurrents. Vernon's eyes darted between Eleanor and Jackson, calculation replacing rage as he apparently realized the precariousness of his position. This isn't over, he finally said, taking a step back. You think you've found yourself a protector, Eleanor. We'll see how long that lasts when the whole town knows you're living in sin with a rancher. He turned his gaze to Jackson. And you. The miners won't take kindly to a man who steals another's wife, might find it hard to sell your beef or buy supplies in town. Threats don't scare me, Hayes, Jackson replied evenly. Now take your friends and leave before this gets uglier. For a moment it seemed Vernon might draw his pistol despite the odds. Then Jed Tompkins laid a restraining hand on his arm. Come on, Vernon, this ain't the time or place. Let's get back to town. Vernon shrugged off the hand but took another step backward. This isn't finished, Eleanor, he called. You remember that. The three men mounted their horses and rode away, Vernon turning once to glare balefully at the cabin before disappearing down the snow-covered trail. Only when they were out of sight did Jackson lower his rifle, the tension visibly draining from his shoulders. You shouldn't have come out, he said, turning to Eleanor. That could have gone badly. I couldn't let you face them alone, she replied, not when it was my problem to solve. A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. Brave, but foolish, Vernon Hayes strikes me as a man who doesn't take well to public defiance. No, Eleanor agreed, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. He doesn't. Jackson ushered her back inside, closing the door firmly behind them. He'll be back, he said, placing the rifle in its rack. Maybe not today, but soon, and next time he won't bring witnesses with better sense than him. Eleanor sank onto a chair, the confrontation having drained her limited strength. What do we do now? We need to get you to Tucson, Jackson decided. As quickly as possible, Judge Parker needs to hear your case before Vernon can cause more trouble. Tucson is nearly a week's journey, Eleanor protested. And I have no proper clothes, no money. I told you I would help, Jackson interrupted gently. And I meant it. I have savings, and there's a trunk of my sister's things that should fit you well enough. Eleanor studied him, still perplexed by his willingness to involve himself in her troubles. Why are you doing this, truly? Vernon was right about one thing: this could make life difficult for you and Bisbee. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, absently scratching Rusty's ears as he considered his answer. When I came west, I was running from memories of war, he finally said. Saw too many men die senselessly, fought for causes that sometimes didn't seem worth the bloodshed. Made me question what kind of world we were building out here. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I decided then that whatever small corner of it I carved out would be a place where right things happened. Where people were treated fairly, with dignity. His simple, heartfelt explanation touched something deep within Eleanor. In Vernon, she'd been drawn to ambition and charm. In Jackson Miller, she saw something far rarer, genuine integrity. "Thank you," she said softly. "I won't forget this kindness." Jackson nodded once, then rose decisively. "We should leave tomorrow at first light. I need to make arrangements for the herd. While I'm gone, my neighbor Caleb Johnson can check on them. And you should rest today. It'll be a hard journey on horseback with your feet still healing." As he busied himself with preparations, Eleanor sat quietly by the fire, contemplating the sudden turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a dutiful, if unhappy, wife, trapped in a deteriorating marriage but seeing no way out. Now she was planning to file for divorce, a scandalous, almost unheard of action for a woman of her standing, and placing her trust in a man she barely knew. Yet something about Jackson Miller inspired confidence. Perhaps it was the quiet way he moved through the world without bluster or false promises. Or perhaps it was the respect with which he treated her, never questioning her account of her marriage or suggesting she return to work things out with Vernon, as she suspected many would have done. Whatever the reason, as she watched him methodically prepare for their journey, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The journey to Tucson proved every bit as difficult as Jackson had predicted. They departed at dawn the next day, Eleanor perched somewhat uncomfortably on Jackson's second horse, a steady mare named Willow. Her feet, still tender from frostbite, throbbed constantly in the stirrups despite the extra padding Jackson had provided. They traveled south and east, keeping to less traveled routes to avoid encountering Vernon or his friends. The terrain grew increasingly arid as they descended from the mountains around Bisbee, crossing stretches of desert punctuated by towering saguaro cacti and scrubby mesquite trees. By night, they camped beneath the stars, Jackson keeping a respectful distance even as he remained vigilantly on watch. On their third evening on the trail, as they sat beside a small fire in a sheltered arroyo, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been troubling her. "What if Judge Parker refuses my petition? What if he sides with Vernon?" Jackson poked at the fire thoughtfully. "Parker has a reputation for fairness. He's granted divorces to women in similar circumstances before. But never someone like me," Eleanor pointed out. "A woman who failed to produce children, who's now traveling alone with another man. Vernon will surely use that against me." "The truth is on your side," Jackson said firmly. "And if necessary, I'll testify about your condition when I found you. No judge worth his salt would send a woman back to a man who nearly killed her, children or no children." Eleanor wasn't as confident, but she appreciated his certainty. And after, if the divorce is granted, what then? It was the question that had haunted her throughout their journey. A divorced woman had few prospects on the frontier. She would be viewed with suspicion by most respectable folk, especially in a conservative mining town like Bisbee. Jackson was silent for a long moment. "You could go east," he finally suggested, "to your aunt in Philadelphia. Fresh start away from the gossip." "With what money?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Even if Judge Parker awards me some settlement from Vernon, it won't be enough for such a journey, and there's no guarantee he'd grant me anything at all." "I told you I would help," Jackson reminded her. "The offer stands." "I can't take your savings," Eleanor protested. "You've done too much already." Jackson's expression grew serious. "Eleanor, I won't pretend to understand everything you've endured, but I recognize someone who deserves a chance at happiness when I see them. If money is what stands between you and that chance, then it's a small price to pay." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at his generosity. "And what about your happiness, Jackson? What do you want?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked away into the flames. "Been alone a long time," he said slowly. "Got used to it, I suppose. The ranch keeps me busy and Rusty's good company." He attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Never much considered what else I might want." Eleanor sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but didn't press. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me about Tucson. What should I expect?" Jackson seemed relieved by the shift. "Bigger than Bisbee, more established. Army post nearby keeps things fairly orderly." Mexican influence is strong, good food, colorful buildings. Judge Parker holds court in a proper courthouse, not a saloon like some territorial judges. As he continued describing the town, Eleanor found herself watching his face in the firelight. Jackson Miller was not classically handsome like Vernon had been, but there was something compelling about his features, the laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he'd known joy despite his solitary life, the strong set of his jaw that spoke of determination, the occasional dimple that appeared when he smiled genuinely. More than his physical attributes, though, it was his character that drew her attention. In their week of travel, she had observed his unfailing kindness, not just to her but to strangers they encountered on the trail. He treated everyone with the same quiet respect: the Mexican traders they'd met yesterday, the Apache family they'd passed this morning, even the surly stable hand at the last-way station. A strange feeling stirred in Eleanor's chest, something she was reluctant to name. Gratitude, certainly. Admiration, undoubtedly, but something else, something that made her heart beat faster when he occasionally caught her watching him. "We should rest," Jackson said, interrupting her thoughts. "Another long day tomorrow," Eleanor nodded, retreating to her bedroll on the opposite side of the fire. But sleep was slow to come, her mind filled with confusing new emotions and the uncertainty of what awaited them in Tucson. Tucson in 1879 was a city in transition, still rough around the edges but showing signs of the civilized community it aspired to become. Adobe buildings lined the dusty streets, interspersed with newer wooden structures housing businesses that catered to the growing population. The courthouse stood proudly on the main square, a solid two-story building that represented law and order in the often chaotic territory. Jackson secured rooms for them at a modest hotel near the courthouse. Separate rooms, Eleanor noted with both relief and a curious disappointment. After nearly a week on the trail, she had grown accustomed to his presence, to the sense of security he provided. "We should see Judge Parker as soon as possible," Jackson said as they ate a simple meal in the hotel's dining room, "before word can reach Vernon about where we've gone." Eleanor nodded, pushing food around her plate with little appetite. Now that they had arrived, anxiety gripped her. What she was attempting was bold, perhaps foolishly so. Few women successfully divorced their husbands, especially without the support of family or powerful friends. "You're worried," Jackson observed. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What I'm asking for, it goes against everything I was raised to believe. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." "I'm no biblical scholar," Jackson said carefully, "but I don't believe God intended for wives to be treated as property, to be discarded in blizzards when they fail to produce sons." Eleanor managed a small smile. "You have a straightforward way of putting things, Jackson Miller. Frontier life doesn't leave much room for dancing around hard truths," he replied with a shrug. "Tomorrow, you tell your story plainly to Judge Parker. Let him see the woman I've come to know, brave, honest, determined. He'd be a fool not to grant your petition." His confidence bolstered her courage. "Will you come with me, to the courthouse?" "Every step of the way," Jackson promised. True to his word, Jackson accompanied Eleanor to the courthouse the next morning. Judge Armand Parker, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and piercing dark eyes, agreed to hear her petition immediately upon learning the circumstances. "Domestic matters involving potential danger take precedence in my court," he explained, ushering them into his chambers rather than the public courtroom. "Mrs. Hayes, please sit. Mr. Miller, you may stay if Mrs. Hayes wishes it." "I do," Eleanor said quickly, grateful for Jackson's steadying presence beside her. For the next hour, Eleanor recounted her marriage to Vernon Hayes, its promising beginning, the gradual descent into cruelty after her first miscarriage, the increasing physical abuse, and finally, the night he had cast her out to die in the blizzard. She spoke without tears, though her voice trembled at times. Judge Parker listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never interrupting her narrative flow. When she finished, he turned to Jackson. "Mr. Miller, you found Mrs. Hayes on your property?" "Yes, Your Honor." On my porch, nearly frozen to death. No coat, no proper shoes, wearing only a thin dress in the worst blizzard we've had in years. Another hour outside and she wouldn't have survived. And you've observed evidence of prior abuse, Jackson nodded grimly. Fading bruises on her arms and face when I found her, and her reaction to sudden movements, the kind of wariness you see in a repeatedly beaten animal. Parker's expression darkened at the comparison. He turned back to Eleanor. Mrs. Hayes, are you aware that your husband could contest this divorce? That he might make accusations regarding your situation with Mr. Miller? I am, Your Honor, Eleanor replied steadily. But Mr. Miller saved my life and has treated me with nothing but respect. If Vernon attempts to slander either of us, it will only further demonstrate his character. The judge studied her for a long moment, then nodded decisively. I've heard enough. The territory of Arizona recognizes cruelty as grounds for divorce, and your case clearly meets that standard. He reached for his pen. I'll issue the decree immediately, along with an order preventing Mr. Hayes from approaching or threatening you. Relief washed over Eleanor like a physical wave. Thank you, Your Honor. As to the matter of property, Parker continued, you are entitled to a portion of any joint assets. Do you and Mr. Hayes own property together? Bank accounts. The cabin we lived in is owned by the mining company, Eleanor explained, and Vernon keeps our money. I don't know exactly how much there is. Parker frowned. I'll include in the decree an order for him to provide an accounting of all assets and to surrender half to you. Whether he'll comply is another matter, but the order will be enforceable by the law. After signing several documents, the judge handed Eleanor, the divorce decree, a single sheet of paper that represented her freedom. This is legally binding throughout the Arizona Territory and recognized by all states and territories of the Union, he explained. You are no longer Mrs. Vernon Hayes, but return to your maiden status as Miss Eleanor Howard. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion as she carefully folded the precious document. I can never repay your fairness. Justice requires no payment, Miss Howard, Parker replied, his stern face softening slightly. I wish you better fortune in your future. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor stood motionless in the bright sunshine, the reality of what had just occurred slowly sinking in. She was free. After 3 years of increasingly miserable marriage, she was her own person again. You did it, Jackson said quietly beside her. Knew you would. Eleanor turned to him, overcome with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Jackson, not any of it. Impulsively, she reached for his hand. I don't know how to thank you. Jackson looked down at their joined hands, a hint of color touching his tan cheeks. No thanks needed, you're the one who found the courage. They stood there a moment longer, connected by more than just clasped hands, before Jackson gently disengaged. We should celebrate, he suggested. Proper meal, maybe. Heard there's a good restaurant near the hotel. I'd like that, Eleanor agreed, tucking the divorce decree safely into her reticule. That evening, over a meal far more elaborate than anything they'd eaten on the trail, Eleanor found herself studying Jackson openly. He looked different in town clothes, a clean shirt and vest, instead of his usual ranch wear, his dark hair neatly combed. He seemed less comfortable, though, as if the trappings of civilization chafed at him. Will you return to your ranch now? She asked, the question that had been hovering between them finally voiced. Jackson nodded. Need to get back to the herd. Caleb's reliable, but he has his own place to run. Of course, Eleanor said, feeling unexpectedly bereft at the thought of their parting. I should find employment here in Tucson, I suppose, perhaps as a seamstress or a shop assistant. Jackson set down his fork, his expression serious. Is that what you want, Eleanor, to stay in Tucson? The directness of the question caught her off guard. I don't know what I want, she admitted. Everything has happened so quickly. A week ago I was trapped in a miserable marriage and now I'm free, but freedom can be its own kind of wilderness, Jackson finished for her. Hard to find your way when there's no path laid out. Exactly, Eleanor said, surprised by his perception. I've never had to decide my own future before, from my father's house to Vernon's, always following someone else's direction. Jackson was quiet for a moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate. Finally, he spoke. There's another option if you want it. Eleanor waited, her heart suddenly beating faster. You could come back to Bisbee, he said. Not to the town itself, but to my ranch. I have a second cabin, built it for my sister before she decided to go east instead. It's small but sound. You could stay there while you figure things out. He rushed on before she could respond. No obligations, just a safe place to plan your next steps and perhaps help around the ranch if you were so inclined. I could pay fair wages. The offer stunned Eleanor. You do that, after all you've already done. Jackson met her gaze directly. I would, for you. He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. That is, I've grown accustomed to your company these past days. Found it agreeable, Eleanor repeated, a small smile playing at her lips. Jackson Miller, she was learning, was not a man given to flowery declarations. More than agreeable, he amended, a hint of that dimple appearing. Truth is, Eleanor, I've lived alone a long time, never minded it much until recently. Now I find myself reluctant to return to that solitude. The admission clearly cost him something. Jackson was not a man who easily revealed his feelings, yet here he was, offering her not just shelter but a reason to believe her company was valued. I've found your company more than agreeable as well, Eleanor said softly. Hope flickered in Jackson's blue eyes. Then you'll consider it. Coming back to the ranch, Eleanor thought about it seriously. Tucson offered more opportunities for employment, more society, more of the civilized comforts she'd known in St. Louis. But it also meant starting completely anew among strangers with the stigma of divorce following her. Returning to the Bisbee area meant potential confrontation with Vernon, gossip from the townspeople, and a more isolated existence. Yet it also meant Jackson's steadying presence, the beautiful mountain landscape she'd come to appreciate, and perhaps something growing between them that she wasn't ready to name but couldn't deny. Yes, she decided, I'll come back with you, at least for a while. The smile that transformed Jackson's face was worth whatever challenges might lie ahead. They departed Tucson 2 days later, having purchased proper traveling clothes for Eleanor and supplies for the journey. The return trip felt different, lighter somehow, without the weight of uncertainty that had accompanied their southward journey. They talked more freely, sharing stories from their pasts and cautious hopes for the future. Eleanor learned that Jackson had grown up in a small Colorado mining town, that he had a sister named Margaret who taught school in Boston, that he had a weakness for apple pie and could play the harmonica, though he claimed not to be very good at it. In return, she told him about her childhood in St. Louis, her mother's work as a midwife that had inspired Eleanor's own interest in healing, her love of books that had found little outlet in Bisbee where reading material was scarce. My cabin has books, Jackson mentioned. Not many, but a decent collection. My father believed in education, whatever his other faults. You're welcome to them. It was these small kindnesses, these glimpses of a shared future, however tentative, that caused Eleanor's feelings for Jackson to deepen with each passing day. By the time they approached Bisbee, she knew with certainty that what she felt was far more than gratitude or friendship. Whether Jackson felt the same remained less clear. He was unfailingly considerate, occasionally even playful as they traveled, but maintained a careful physical distance. Not once had he attempted to touch her beyond necessary assistance, mounting or dismounting her horse. Eleanor found herself both appreciating his restraint and wishing, in moments of quiet honesty with herself, that he might be less circumspect. They reached Jackson's ranch in the early evening of their 6th day of travel. Eleanor felt a surprising sense of homecoming as the familiar cabin came into view, nestled against the foothills with the barn and corral nearby. Rusty raced out to meet them, barking joyously at their return. Someone missed you, Eleanor observed, watching Jackson dismount to greet the excited dog. Just hungry, more likely, Jackson replied, though his smile belied the dismissive words. He helped Eleanor down from her horse, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he stepped back. Let me show you the other cabin before it gets dark. The second cabin stood about 100 yards from the main house, partially sheltered by a stand of ponderosa pines. It was smaller than Jackson's home but solidly built, with a covered porch and 2 windows facing the valley below. "It's lovely," Eleanor said sincerely as Jackson opened the door. The interior was simple, one main room with a small cookstove, table and chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a few shelves built into the wall. A braided rug covered part of the plank floor, adding a touch of comfort. "Margaret lived here for 6 months before deciding frontier life wasn't for her," Jackson explained. "She left most of her furnishings, said it was too much trouble to ship east." "It's perfect," Eleanor assured him, already envisioning making the space her own. "Far more than I could have hoped for." Jackson looked relieved. "Good, there's firewood stacked out back, and I'll bring over some provisions from the main cabin. Should be comfortable enough." As he bustled about getting her settled, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of emotions. She was grateful for this haven, this chance to start anew. Yet she also felt a twinge of disappointment at the physical distance the arrangement established between them. It was proper, of course, the only acceptable living situation for an unmarried man and woman. But part of her had grown accustomed to Jackson's presence, the comfort of knowing he was nearby. "I'll let you rest," Jackson said when everything was arranged. "Been a long journey. We can talk tomorrow about how things will work with the ranch and all." Eleanor nodded, suddenly shy. "Thank you, Jackson, for everything." He tipped his hat, a gesture that struck her as endearingly formal after their days of travel together. "Good night, Eleanor." As she watched him walk back toward his own cabin, Eleanor wondered what the coming days would bring. She was truly free for the first time in her adult life, with choices to make and a future to shape. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Whatever happened, she knew one thing with certainty. Her feelings for Jackson Miller had become the truest, most important thing in her new life. Whether he would ever return, those feelings remained to be seen. Life at the ranch quickly settled into a comfortable routine. True to his word, Jackson paid Eleanor for her help with cooking, mending, and tending to the kitchen garden she established behind her cabin. The work was satisfying, far different from the drudgery of her life with Vernon, where nothing she did ever seemed good enough. Jackson was often busy with ranch work, mending fences, tending to the cattle, breaking horses for neighboring ranchers. But evenings were spent together, sometimes in Eleanor's cabin where she would cook dinner, sometimes in Jackson's where they would read from his collection of books. As spring advanced toward summer, Eleanor found herself falling more deeply in love with both the land and the man. The mountains around Bisbee burst into unexpected color as wildflowers carpeted the meadows. Jackson showed her hidden places, a secluded valley filled with lupines, a small waterfall tucked into a rocky crevice, a high ridge where eagles nested. On one such excursion in late May, they stopped to rest in a sun-dappled clearing. Eleanor spread out the lunch she'd packed while Jackson saw to the horses. It felt wonderfully domestic, like a scene from a life she hadn't dared to imagine for herself. "This is beautiful country," she observed as Jackson settled beside her on the blanket. "I never appreciated it properly before." "Hard to see beauty when you're suffering," Jackson replied, accepting the sandwich she offered, "but it's always been here waiting." Eleanor glanced at him, wondering if he was speaking of more than just the landscape. In the 2 months since their return from Tucson, something had shifted between them, a deepening of their easy companionship, an increasing frequency of looks that lingered a beat too long, of hands that brushed accidentally during shared tasks. Yet neither had spoken of feelings beyond friendship. Jackson remained unfailingly respectful, never presuming, never pushing. Eleanor appreciated his restraint even as she sometimes longed for him to break it. "I've had news from town," Jackson said, interrupting her thoughts. "Caleb Johnson brought it when he came to trade for that yearling bull yesterday." Eleanor tensed slightly. News from Bisbee had been scarce since their return by mutual agreement. She had no desire to hear gossip about herself or worse, updates on Vernon's activities. "What news?" she asked cautiously. "Vernon Hayes left Bisbee," Jackson said, watching her face carefully. "Took a job with a mining operation in Nevada, departed 2 weeks ago, according to Caleb." Eleanor absorbed this information, surprised by the surge of relief that washed through her. She hadn't realized how much tension she'd been carrying, the constant, subconscious fear of encountering Vernon or hearing that he was looking for her. "Good," she said simply. "That's good," Jackson nodded. "Thought you'd want to know, changes things a bit." "How so?" Eleanor asked. "Well," Jackson set down his sandwich, suddenly seeming nervous. "Thought perhaps you might like to go into town sometime, for supplies or just to see people, if you wanted." The suggestion caught Eleanor off guard. In their 2 months at the ranch, she hadn't left the property once, content in their isolated existence, but with Vernon gone. "I think I would like that," she said slowly. "Not right away, perhaps, but soon." Jackson looked pleased. "Whenever you're ready, no rush." He hesitated, then added, "There's a social at the church next Saturday. Dance and potluck dinner might be a nice way to show folks you're doing well." Eleanor understood what he wasn't saying. Returning to Bisbee as a divorced woman would spark gossip no matter what, but appearing at a community event, composed and respectable, would go a long way toward shaping the narrative. "Will you escort me?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "If you want me to," Jackson replied, that hint of color touching his cheeks again. "I do," Eleanor said firmly. "Very much." The week leading up to the social passed in a flurry of activity. Eleanor unearthed her best dress from the trunk, a blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and spent hours altering it to fit her figure, which had filled out healthily during her time at the ranch. Jackson, too, seemed preoccupied with preparations, making an extra trip to town for supplies and spending one afternoon mysteriously absent from the ranch entirely. When Saturday arrived, Eleanor found herself uncharacteristically nervous as she dressed for the social. It would be her first public appearance since the divorce, her first time facing the scrutiny of the Bisbee community. More importantly, it would be her first outing with Jackson that could be construed as something more than neighborly companionship. A knock at her door announced his arrival. Eleanor opened it to find Jackson standing on her porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean black suit that she'd never seen before. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw. "You look beautiful," he said before she could speak, his eyes taking in her blue dress and carefully arranged hair. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, a blush warming her cheeks. "You're quite handsome yourself. Is that a new suit?" Jackson looked slightly embarrassed. "Had it made in Tucson while you were meeting with Judge Parker. Figured I might need it someday." The thought that he had been planning for such an occasion, even then, touched Eleanor deeply. "It suits you," she said softly. Jackson offered his arm with formal courtesy, and they walked together to the waiting buggy, also apparently new, or at least freshly painted and polished. The attention to detail revealed a side of Jackson she hadn't fully appreciated before, his desire to make this evening special, to present himself, and by extension, her, in the best possible light to the community. The drive to Bisbee took nearly an hour, giving Eleanor time to compose herself for what lay ahead. Jackson seemed to sense her nervousness, keeping the conversation light and occasionally pointing out changes in the landscape since she'd last seen it. The church sat at the edge of town, its white steeple visible long before they reached the outskirts of Bisbee. Light spilled from its windows into the gathering dusk, and the sounds of a fiddle and piano drifted through the open doors. Buggies and horses lined the small churchyard, indicating a good turnout for the social. "Ready?" Jackson asked as he helped Eleanor down from the buggy. She took a deep breath, adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. "Ready." They entered the church together, Jackson's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. The conversations nearest the door faltered momentarily as heads turned to observe the new arrivals. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares but kept her chin high, her posture straight. "Miss Howard, how lovely to see you." A familiar voice broke the awkward silence. Mrs. Thornton, the minister's wife, approached with genuine warmth. "And Mr. Miller, you've finally decided to join us for a social. What a pleasant surprise." Her gracious welcome eased the tension immediately. Others followed her lead, coming forward to greet them, some with sincere pleasure, others with poorly disguised curiosity. Jackson remained steadfastly at Eleanor's side, his presence lending her strength as she navigated the social currents. "Would you care to dance?" he asked when the initial flurry of greetings subsided. The musicians had struck up a lively reel, and couples were forming sets in the center of the church hall. Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether such a public display would be wise. "Unless you'd rather not," Jackson added, misinterpreting her hesitation. "I'd love to," Eleanor decided. Let them talk, she thought. She had done nothing wrong, had nothing to be ashamed of. Jackson proved to be a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent most of his life on horseback. As they moved through the patterns of the reel, Eleanor felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The music, the movement, Jackson's steady presence all combined to create a sense of joy that transcended the curious glances and whispered comments from the sidelines. When the dance ended, Jackson led her to the refreshment table for a cup of punch. They were joined by Caleb Johnson and his wife Martha, friendly faces in the crowd. "Good to see you in town, Eleanor," Martha said sincerely, "and looking so well, ranch life must agree with you." "It does," Eleanor confirmed. "I've found peace there that I didn't know was possible." Martha's knowing glance between Eleanor and Jackson suggested she understood more than was being said. "Well, we're glad to have you back among us. And Jackson, too, he's been a hermit for too long." "Been busy with the ranch," Jackson protested mildly. "Too busy for church socials for 8 years, Martha teased. "I think you just needed the right incentive to attend." She winked at Eleanor, who felt her cheeks grow warm. The evening continued pleasantly, with more dancing, conversation with neighbors who proved more welcoming than Eleanor had feared, and a delicious potluck supper. There were a few cold shoulders, a few judgmental looks, but overall, the community seemed willing to accept her return without excessive scandal. It was nearly midnight when they finally departed, Eleanor pleasantly tired but content with how the evening had unfolded. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both of them absorbed in their own thoughts beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. "Thank you for tonight," Eleanor said as they approached the ranch. It was healing in a way to face everyone and find most of them kind. "You did all the hard work," Jackson replied, standing tall, showing them the strong woman you are. "I just provided the transportation." Eleanor smiled at his modest assessment. "You provided much more than that, Jackson Miller, and you know it." He pulled the buggy to a stop between their cabins and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. In the moonlight, his expression was unreadable, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested internal conflict. "Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Eleanor asked impulsively, not ready for the evening to end. Jackson hesitated. "It's late," he said, though he made no move to step away. "Not too late," Eleanor countered softly. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Jackson nodded. Coffee would be nice. Inside her cabin, Eleanor busied herself with the stove, acutely aware of Jackson's presence as he removed his hat and jacket, draping them over a chair with careful precision. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly how natural it felt to have him in her space, how right. When the coffee was ready, she brought 2 cups to the small table where Jackson had seated himself. Their fingers brushed as she handed him his cup, sending a current of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. "Eleanor," Jackson began, his voice lower than usual, "there's something I've been wanting to say for some time now." Her heart quickened. "Yes." Jackson set down his coffee untouched, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "These past months, having you here at the ranch, they've been the happiest of my life, and I find myself hoping that you might consider. That is, I wonder if you might." He faltered, then tried again. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I've fallen in love with you. Probably started the moment you opened your eyes in my cabin after the blizzard, and if you don't feel the same, I understand completely. You've been through so much, and the last thing you need is—" Eleanor leaned across the table and pressed her lips to his, effectively stopping his nervous speech. It was a brief kiss, chaste but unmistakable in its intent. When she drew back, Jackson looked stunned. "I love you too," Eleanor said simply. I think I have for months now. The wonder that spread across Jackson's face was beautiful to behold. He reached across the table to take her hands in his. I never dared hope, he admitted. Thought perhaps you were just grateful or that you needed more time to heal from everything with Vernon. I was grateful, Eleanor acknowledged. Still am, but what I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude, Jackson. You showed me what a good man truly is, not through grand gestures, but through daily kindness, through respect and patience. Jackson rose from his chair, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. This time when they kissed, it was deeper, a true expression of the feelings that had been building between them. Eleanor melted against him, her hands sliding up to touch his face, to feel the strong line of his jaw beneath her fingers. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. I should go, he said reluctantly, before I forget myself entirely. Eleanor appreciated his restraint, even as part of her wished he would stay. Will I see you tomorrow? Jackson smiled, that dimple appearing briefly. Wild horses couldn't keep me away. He kissed her once more softly before retrieving his hat and jacket. At the door he turned back. Eleanor. Yes, I want to court you properly. No rushing, no pressure. You deserve that, the asking and the giving freely in your own time. His old-fashioned declaration touched her deeply. I'd like that very much, she replied. After he left, Eleanor stood in the center of her cabin, fingers pressed to lips that still tingled from his kiss. For the first time since she was a young girl, she allowed herself to dream of a future filled with love, with partnership, with belonging. And for the first time, such dreams seemed within reach. The following months were a revelation for Eleanor. Jackson courted her with a thoughtfulness that constantly surprised her. Wildflowers left on her porch in the morning, a hand-carved wooden box for her sewing notions, books borrowed from the town's small lending library that he thought she might enjoy. More precious than these gifts was the time they spent together. Jackson taught Eleanor to ride properly, laughing with genuine delight the first time she cantered across an open meadow on her own. She taught him to make proper biscuits, their hands flour-covered as they worked side by side at her small table. In the evenings, they often sat on her porch watching the sunset, talking about everything and nothing, gradually sharing the deeper parts of themselves that they had kept guarded for so long. Their physical relationship progressed slowly, with a restraint that sometimes tested them both. Each kiss grew more passionate, each embrace more difficult to end. Yet Jackson never presumed, never pushed beyond what Eleanor was comfortable giving. His respect for her boundaries only deepened her love for him. By late summer, Eleanor knew with certainty that she wanted to spend her life with this man. One evening, as they sat watching stars appear in the deepening twilight, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Jackson, she said quietly, I've been thinking. He turned to look at her, his profile outlined in silver moonlight. About us, about the future. Eleanor took a deep breath. I love you more than I ever thought possible, and I don't want to wait anymore. Jackson straightened in his chair. Eleanor, are you saying? I'm saying that life is short and uncertain, she interrupted. The blizzard taught me that, and I want to spend whatever years I have with you as your wife, building something meaningful together. For a moment, Jackson was silent, and Eleanor felt a flash of doubt. Had she misread his intentions? Was he not ready for such a commitment? Then he was kneeling before her chair, taking her hands in his. I've been carrying this for weeks, he said, reaching into his pocket to produce a small ring with a single pearl set in gold. Waiting for the right moment, afraid of asking too soon. His voice grew husky with emotion. Eleanor Howard, I love you more than I have words to express. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Joy bubbled up inside Eleanor, spilling over in a brilliant smile. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Bisbee. Martha Johnson stood as Eleanor's witness, and Caleb as Jackson's. The congregation was small but supportive, the community having largely accepted the relationship between the divorced woman and the rancher who had saved her life. Eleanor wore a new dress of ivory silk, her one extravagance, ordered from Tucson for the occasion. Jackson wore his black suit, freshly pressed, with a new string tie and polished boots. They spoke their vows clearly, their voices steady with certainty, their hands clasped tightly together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words that had once troubled Eleanor now filled her with peace. This union, built on mutual respect and deep love, truly felt blessed in a way her first marriage never had. The wedding supper was held at the Johnsons' home, a joyful celebration that lasted well into the evening. When they finally departed, driving back to the ranch beneath a canopy of stars, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of excitement and serenity. "Happy, Mrs. Miller?" Jackson asked, his arm wrapped securely around her waist as he guided the horses with his other hand. "Incredibly so, Mr. Miller," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "And you, more than I ever thought possible," he admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Never imagined finding someone like you, especially not half frozen on my doorstep during the worst blizzard in years." Eleanor laughed softly, not the most conventional beginning to a love story, but a fitting one for us, Jackson said. "Found each other in the cold, built something warm together." His poetic observation surprised and delighted her. "Why, Jackson Miller, you're a romantic beneath that practical exterior." "Only for you," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice even in the darkness. When they reached the ranch, Jackson surprised her by stopping the buggy in front of his cabin rather than hers. Before she could question him, he set the brake and turned to her. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her down from the buggy. "A wedding present of sorts." Taking her hand, he led her not to the front door, but around the side of the cabin to a newly constructed addition she hadn't noticed during her most recent visits. Jackson opened a door and gestured for her to enter. Inside, Eleanor found a bright, airy room with large windows facing east. A sturdy table stood in one corner with a comfortable chair beside it. Bookshelves lined one wall, already partially filled with volumes. A small desk occupied another corner, topped with writing materials. "Your study," Jackson explained somewhat nervously. "For reading, writing, whatever pursuits you enjoy. I know how much you love books and thought you might want a space of your own in our home." Eleanor turned to him, deeply moved by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "How did you manage to build it without my noticing?" Jackson looked pleased with himself. "Had Caleb and some of the men from town help while you were busy with wedding preparations. Martha was in on it too, kept you occupied in town longer than necessary several times." "Conspirators, all of you," Eleanor said with a laugh. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Thank you, it's the most wonderful gift." "There's more," Jackson admitted. "Come." He led her through the rest of the cabin, which had been subtly transformed in ways large and small. The main room had new curtains and a comfortable settee she'd never seen before. The kitchen had been expanded slightly, with new shelves and a larger stove, and the bedroom. Eleanor paused in the doorway, taking in the new larger bed with its handsome quilt, the dressing table by the window, the wardrobe that stood ready for her clothes. "I wanted our home to feel like yours too," Jackson explained, "not just my place where you happen to live." "Our home," Eleanor repeated softly, loving the sound of those words. She turned to face him, overwhelmed with love for this thoughtful, generous man. "It's beautiful, all of it, but you know I would have been happy anywhere as long as we were together." "I know," Jackson said, drawing her into his arms. "That's what makes you so easy to love, and so deserving of everything I can give you." Their kiss deepened, taking on a new urgency now that they stood in the privacy of their bedroom as husband and wife. Eleanor felt herself responding to his touch with a passion that no longer needed to be restrained, a desire that could finally be fully expressed. "I love you, Eleanor Miller," Jackson whispered against her lips. "And I love you," she replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such joy. "Now and always." In that moment, as Jackson's lips found hers again, Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought her here from the desperate woman nearly frozen to death in a blizzard to this woman wrapped in the arms of a man who cherished her. Life's path was unpredictable, sometimes terrifyingly so, but standing in the warmth of their home, in the circle of Jackson's embrace, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true haven at last. 5 years passed, years filled with hard work, laughter, occasional struggles, and deepening love. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding to include a larger herd, better grazing land purchased from a neighbor who returned east, and a small apple orchard that Eleanor had planted their first spring as husband and wife. Their family grew too. In the winter of 1881, Eleanor gave birth to a son they named William, after Jackson's father. The joy of finally holding a healthy child in her arms was indescribable, made even sweeter by Jackson's awestruck expression as he cradled his son for the first time. "He's perfect," Jackson had whispered, tears glistening in his eyes, "just like his mother." 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, a spirited little girl with her father's blue eyes and dimpled smile. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing family, with Jackson adding 2 small bedrooms for the children. Eleanor never returned to the fearful woman she had once been. The challenges of ranch life, harsh winters, dry summers, occasional illnesses, were faced with a resilience born of knowing she was truly loved, truly valued. Jackson remained her steadfast partner, never patronizing, always respecting her intelligence and strength even as he protected and supported her. Word reached them occasionally about Vernon. He had remarried in Nevada, a young widow with 2 sons of her own, the ready-made family he had always wanted. Eleanor felt nothing but distant pity for the woman who had taken her place, hoping that Vernon had learned some measure of kindness with age. On a crisp autumn day in 1884, Eleanor stood on the porch of their home, watching Jackson teach 5-year-old William to ride his first pony. Sarah, now 2, played at her feet with carved wooden animals Jackson had made for her. The sight of her family, her incredible, unexpected family, filled Eleanor with such gratitude that it caught in her throat. "Easy does it, Will," Jackson called as the boy clutched the pony's mane with determined concentration. "That's it, son, you've got it." William's face split into a wide grin as he successfully guided the patient pony around the corral. "Look, Mama, I'm riding." "I see, darling," Eleanor called back, her heart swelling with pride. "You're doing wonderfully." Later that evening, after the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Eleanor and Jackson sat together on the porch, his arm around her shoulders as they enjoyed the peaceful twilight. These quiet moments together remained one of their greatest pleasures, a time to connect after busy days spent managing ranch and family. "Penny for your thoughts," Jackson said, noticing her contemplative expression. Eleanor smiled, leaning into his embrace. "I was thinking about that blizzard," she admitted. "About how close I came to never knowing this life." Jackson tightened his arm around her. Even after 5 years, the memory of finding her nearly frozen on his porch still affected him deeply. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, Eleanor Miller. You would have found your way to happiness somehow." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I'm endlessly grateful that my way led to you." She turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Do you ever wonder at the circumstances that brought us together? How something as terrible as that night could lead to something so beautiful?" Jackson considered the question thoughtfully. "I've learned that life rarely moves in straight lines," he said finally. "Sometimes the harshest storms lead to the clearest skies." He pressed a kiss to her temple, "And finding you was worth weathering any storm." "Such poetry from a practical rancher," Eleanor teased, though his words touched her deeply. "You bring it out in me," Jackson replied with a smile. "Among many other things I never knew were in me." As darkness settled over their land, they continued to sit together in comfortable silence, their lives so thoroughly intertwined now that words were often unnecessary. The ranch around them slept, children dreaming in their beds, cattle settled in the pastures, chickens roosting in their coop. From desperate beginnings had grown this rich, full life that Eleanor cherished with every fiber of her being. Vernon's cruelty, intended to punish her, had instead set her on the path to true happiness. The blizzard that should have killed her had delivered her to the doorstep of the man who would become her heart's companion. "Come inside, love," Jackson said eventually, rising and offering his hand. "Tomorrow comes early." Eleanor took his hand, allowing him to pull her gently to her feet. "I love you, Jackson Miller," she said, the words as heartfelt now as the first time she'd spoken them. "And I love you," he replied, his blue eyes warm with an emotion that had only deepened with the passing years. Now and always. Hand in hand, they entered their home, closing the door on the cool autumn night. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the pines that surrounded their cabin, not the howling fury of a deadly blizzard, but the gentle whisper of a world at peace, sheltering the family that had found, against all odds, their perfect haven together.